Hi guys. So after having some conversations with some of you over the last week or so, there are going to be some changes to try and help you align what your goal is for a particular lecture. If you would notice in your Google Classroom, there should be a document that is called a study guide, but really it's a list of like usable objectives. And so hopefully it'll align with the modules you're doing. It could align with the lab as well. I'm also going to be structuring your off weeks a little bit differently, so you have more of a purpose on those off weeks. And there'll be some lab changes to the PowerPoints and to the videos. I'm taking all of the junk out, so there's no learning outcomes, no review, and just kind of streamlining the information you need to know. We're also going to take the clinical modules and we're going to work on those on Fridays. So on Fridays, you will notice we take all of those sections in the chapters and we'll talk about a case study and kind of apply all that information as a group. So let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to try and keep this one, and I'm also going to try to keep the videos between 10-15 minutes. So that means there'll be more of the video, so make sure you catch all of them. So this section, this next exam, is all going to be about the skeletal system, our next system of study. Chapter 6 is going to look at bones. It's going to look at some general terminology for bones. And it's going to look at some bone physiology, maintaining the bones, growing bones, things like that. Chapter 7 is going to mostly focus on the naming of bones and bone features. Chapter 8 is going to be all about joints. So it really does chunk the information about the skeletal system really nicely. There may not be a video for Chapter 7 because it is covered in lab so strongly. We have, I think, 2 weeks dedicated to the skeletal system and joints. So just prepare for that kind of information. So let's get started with Chapter 6. I am on page 211 in your textbook, and there's some great pictures. Make sure you look at those modified learning objectives, which AKA the study guide, to see what will align with this portion of the lecture. Okay, so our goal here is to learn about the divisions of the skeletal system. And there's 2 main divisions, the axial and the appendicular. The axial is 80 bones that include the skull, bones of the thorax, and the vertebral column. Appendicular skeleton includes 126 bones of the arms and legs, and you can see they are color-coded. The skeletal system also includes the associated cartilages, especially when we talk about bone growth and the joints. We'll talk about cartilage, and it also includes other connective tissues and ligaments. Bone is, of course, a connective tissue, a strong connective tissue. So the functions, you may have guessed support, protection, and leverage. You might have thought, like, yeah, that's the obvious ones. The skeletal system helps me stand up, helps to protect my organs. But you might not have thought of these 2. It's also very important to store minerals and lipids. Calcium is a huge area of storage, these bones. And there are cells that break down bones and release calcium, and there are cells that build the bone back up and absorb calcium. Also produce blood cells. So the marrow inside of a long bone is able to, well, in the cavities of bones, are able to produce all the types of blood cells, red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets for the circulatory system. Okay, we have some categories of bones, and this just helps us to kind of categorize by shape. There are 6 categories. If you flip to page 212, you have a beautiful graphic that shows you the 6 categories. And I have some examples over here that I'm going to pull in, and hopefully you'll be able to see a little bit of. So let's start off with the flat bones. So flat bones have, they are very wide, and as the name implies, flat. They're also very thin. Okay, this is a scapula, which is it's actually a shoulder bone. Okay, these are very important in protecting things underneath it because it's so wide. It's able to protect a lot of underlying soft tissue. We also have something called sutural bones. So these are the cranial bones. These are actually flat bones as well, the parietal bones being these guys. But if you can see this line, when you're born, that line doesn't exist. That's actually a gap between these bones. And that's good because this melon here has to get through birth canal. So in order to do that, we got to kind of move the bones around. That's why some babies are kind of born misshapen, but it's also why you have a soft spot because it hasn't developed yet. So as you grow, these sutures fuse. And then of course there's no soft spot. So those are sutural bones. Long bones. So there are things like the femur. This is a nice long femur here. And the humerus, a nice long humerus, which is the upper arm bone. They are longer than they are wider. They are very obviously long bones. You also have your finger and toe bones, which are also long. Irregular bones, kind of oddball shaped. You have complex shapes. So I have a bag of vertebrae here, and I'm gonna kind of pull out some of the vertebrae right here. Okay, this is a lumbar vertebrae. Okay, and if you look at it, kind of looks like a moose. Lumbar vertebrae look like moose. And if I look at some thoracic, okay, some cervical and thoracic, this is a thoracic, and that kind of looks like a giraffe, right? So I'm not saying all irregular bones look like animals, but that's some fun trivia for you. Vertebral bones. There's also pelvic bones are also irregularly shaped. And they have all sorts of grooves and smooth areas and protrusions and things like that. Sesamoid bones, like your kneecap. Sesamoid bones are, I dropped my kneecap. Because they kind of float. They float inside tendons, and so they don't really articulate with other bones in a joint, just kind of floats in the tendons. And then you have short bones like your wrist and ankle bones. Here is some ankle bones here, and these are short bones, and that's because they're as wide or as they are long. And so here's kind of an overview of some examples of these bones and the names. And just a general way to categorize those. The next section, and this will be the end of this video, is on page 213, which are talking about bone markings or bone features, okay? These are all related to a particular function. So the picture on page 213 is fantastic. And so I want to go through some of these features, but I thought I would do it with the bones rather than just show you what you can see in the book. So I'm going to pause here, and you'll see my face nice and big and bright. And I'm going to point out some of these features. So again, if you don't have your book, page 213 is where you should be. Okay, I think I've collected all the bones I need. Again, I'm on 213. And these bone markings, these features are, they're there for a purpose. They all have a purpose. And usually it's to connect, you know, like in the case of any kind of projection, it's to connect to a ligament or to a tendon or to a muscle. It could be a depression that also is making space. It could be a hole, which is for a vessel or for a nerve. Okay, they all have a purpose. So function fits the structure. So we're going to start with this skull here and going through some bone markings on the skull. And I'm using the textbook here so that I make sure that I don't miss any. I hope I didn't mess with the volume there. Okay, so here's a skull, okay? And so we have, if you look in the eye sockets there, the eye has a nerve in the back, and so there's a canal that kind of connects in through there, and that eye nerve will actually connect to the brain, and so that's a canal, or it's also called a meatus. Process, so something like this is the zygomatic process. Okay, this is a projection or a bump. A sinus, so if I have one downstairs that's not here. If I were to cut this in half, you could see the sinuses, or these openings, and it's usually filled with air, and we have two big ones right here. We also have some here and some here, but you can't see it because you have to open up the bone. A foramen is a hole, a small passageway, usually for a vessel or a blood vessel or nerve. A big one right there. And a fissure is some kind of cleft or gap. And you can kind of see here, there's this cleft, okay? It's not the canal that connects it, it's that gap. Okay, so those are some bone markings of the skull. So of the humerus, here I have a lovely humerus. I'm gonna have to back off a little bit here. We do have a head of the humerus, which is the proximal end that connects to a joint, and this is kind of the ball end of that. We have a tubercle, which is another rounded, smaller projection, and this is a tubercle, okay? And right next to that, you see a sulcus right here, which is this valley, this groove. A tuberosity, now this is not great on this one because it's just worn, but a tuberosity is kind of like a rough projection. So it's kind of like it's like this skinny mountain kind of thing, but it's real rough, okay? The diaphysis is the long part of the bone, so it's the shaft. A trochlea, it's kind of shaped like a pulley, so here would be the trochlea, and then the rounded portion that articulates with a joint, that's called the condyle, okay? So we actually have a condyle here on the femur as well, okay? There is, on the anterior surface here, there's a facet, okay? That's also going to be part of the knee, okay? Diaphysis and the head is the same, but this time the head is connected to a neck, so this area that connects the head to the long diaphysis, okay? And then we have this long, this other projection over here, that's called a trochanter. Okay, so when we talk in the next chapter about the femur, they will all have fancy special names. But for this chapter, you want to go ahead and just memorize the terms. And of the pelvis, where did my pelvis go? Here it is. Okay, there it is right here. There we go, like this. So then we have this prominent crest right here. This smooth, flat fossa, okay? We've got a line right here. It's kind of a ridge, but it's a flatter ridge. Not as prominent as the crest. A spine right here is kind of the part that pokes out. And a ramus, which is any kind of thick projection. So that's this area right here. Okay, go ahead and make sure you're reviewing all of that vocabulary. The idea is to know how to know those terms so that when you come across them in the next chapter, you know what they're referring to.